play. Hi, everyone. My name's Nadia. I'm from the Woodbridge Public Library. We want to thank everyone for coming out to attend tonight's Narrative Threads presentation. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to direct them to me in the chat. I can answer it to you privately or in the group chat. And I just want to give you guys a little bit more information. So all of your mics are, I think for the most part, they're muted. But if you have a question or a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in, and Hilary will answer your questions. Just remember to remute yourself after you're done asking the question, because it's going to help with the sound quality and keep us all focused. And also, if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, which I'm sure you will, please be sure to check our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, our website, woodbridgelibrary.org. We have a bunch of activities coming up, more with the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts, and also just in general. And now for our speaker tonight, her name is Hilary May from the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts, located in Madison, New Jersey. Please join me in welcoming Hilary to our library.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I'm happy to be here. It's my first time doing anything for your library, but I'm really excited to be doing a couple coming up here. As Nadia said, I'm happy to hear from you. I know sometimes the virtual programs can be a little bit disconnecting, so please feel free to jump in with questions, comments. I know already that several of you are quilters and you know, may have other textile artists here or anything, so please do share your stories and experiences as well. I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the historical side of things, but definitely please bring in your own input as well as we go through here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and start with a little bit about the museum to start. So let me just share. Give me 1 second here to get this going. Okay. So have any of you been to visit the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts? I'll look for any nodding heads there, anything. So if you've ever been to Madison, it's a little bit of a distance, but if you've ever been to Madison or driven through, you may have seen it. And it's a beautiful building right on the corner of Main Street, right in downtown Madison. It looks like a church. If you drove past, you would assume this was one of the many churches in Madison, because it does look like that. I'll show you the inside in a minute. It looks like a church inside as well, but it was never a church. It was, in fact, Madison's first public library. And you can see in this picture just barely, it's very hard to make out, but over that archway there's some letters. It does say library carved in there. It was built in 1899 by a man called D. Willis James as a gift to the town of Madison. It was intentionally built to look like a church, to sort of inspire people to learning and reading, the way you might feel inspired walking into a beautiful church. So this is what the building looked like on the inside when it was a library. This room here was the main reading room. So you wouldn't have been able to browse the shelves in those earliest days of the library. You would have told the librarian what book you wanted. They would go get it for you from the stacks, which you can see at the very back of the picture. If you see a balcony, and the upper and lower, you can sort of see bookshelves. That would have been on both sides. And that's where the books were. The librarian would bring you your book and you would read it in the reading room. It did have electricity. Those are electric lights right on the desks there. So it was a pretty modern building for the time. And it did remain the town's library until the 1960s, when it was just too small for this growing town. And the library moved to its current location. And there was a couple in town who had been collecting just thousands of objects of everyday life from the 18th and 19th century. A lot of tools from craftspeople and farmers, but also things like textiles. And they asked the town if they could open a museum in this now vacant building. And fortunately, the town said yes, and the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts was born in 1969. So this shows you a little bit better what it looks like today. So although it's obviously this picture was taken more recently, all of the architectural and decorative elements are original to the building. So if we'd had color photography in 1899, all of that would have looked exactly the same. the vaulted arch ceilings, hand-stenciled walls, stained glass windows, all of these really, really beautiful elements that made it a beautiful library and a beautiful building for us to have for our museum as well here. And lots has changed about the museum in sort of the over 50 years that we've been around, but we're still dedicated to telling the stories of the everyday people of New Jersey from the 18th and 19th century, which is, you know, where today's topic fits right in. The narrative threads was actually an exhibit we had that you can sort of see installed in that room there. I will say that that room we're looking into now, that's what was the main reading room. We're sort of looking at it from the opposite angle, but it's that same room that was the main reading room. It's now an exhibit space, and the narrative threads have sort of turned it into a program, but based on that exhibit that we had a couple years ago. So I just want to give a chance if anyone does have any questions or anything on the museum or the building itself before I get more into the narrative threads itself here. So if anyone has anything, feel free to unmute yourself or throw it in the chat if you have any museum or building related questions before we dive more into our narrative threads. Okay, and I know we have some quilters here tonight. Anyone else who's any sort of textile artist of any kind, any knitters, crocheters, lace workers, weavers, anyone else do any sort of textile work or sewing even, anything they want to admit to? If anyone admits to being, I see a hand there, Debbie. Debbie, you do some. Anyone else? Anyone else? That's okay. You can jump in as we go if you want to add something when we get to, we won't be covering every type of textile work, but if we get to your particular favored textile work. So this program, we're going to be looking, as I said, sort of a historical look at textiles. We're going to start by looking at some of the raw materials, the things that we don't really think about today. Even people who do any sort of textile work tend to start with, you know, things that are already processed into yarn or thread. So we're going to talk about what makes that up, you know, steps that still have to occur today, but which would have been much, much more involved in the 18th and 19th century. So looking at where those came from and the processing of those raw materials. And then we'll be looking at a variety of finished products as well, focusing on ones from the museum's collection. Yeah, please do jump in with questions as I go along. I'll try to pause periodically, but do please feel free to just jump in and flag me down and interrupt me as we go through. I see Kathy saying sewing, quilting, embroidery, excellent. Glad to see that. So yes, please do that. Throw it in the chat or jump in as we go along. Right, so we're gonna start here with our first raw materials. So wool would have been one of the most common materials used in the 19th century in New Jersey because you could just grow it on your sheep. Makes it nice and easily accessible because it doesn't have to come from somewhere else. And I'll be holding up a few things now. I know it's going to be teeny tiny, so I'm going to hold these up again at the end when I sort of go back to full screen, but kind of thinking about the different look and texture of these raw materials. And think about it on the sheep, and we'll go through some of that processing here. Oh, I see. Esther is learning sewing and quilting. Excellent, excellent. Cotton would have been another very common material used in the 19th century, and of course still today. So cotton, of course, doesn't grow in New Jersey, but it was fairly readily available. So there was quite a strong interaction. There was a lot of cotton mills in New Jersey. And so it was most of it grown in the South by enslaved people, but then brought up and processed at Northeast textile mills, including many that were in New Jersey. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton established the first mills in Paterson using those wonderful falls, that water power. And the first cotton mill started very, very shortly after that. So really right at the start of the Industrial Revolution, New Jersey is there with textile factories from the start. The flax would have been another locally available material. Flax, of course, becomes linen, something that we don't use as much today. Linen has fallen out of favor for probably various reasons, including that as a fabric, it's not the softest, it's a little rougher, and it wrinkles so easily, right? You sort of look sideways at something linen and it's wrinkled on you. So it's sort of fallen out of favor. But we might still have linen napkins or little linen tablecloths that we might use, but it's not something we tend to use for clothing anymore today. But flax is something which really also requires a whole lot of processing. So you think about wool and cotton, they're not as far removed from the finished product. It's still lots of processing, but you can sort of see how they're a textile. When you look at the flax plant growing on the left-hand side there, it's hard to imagine that becoming a textile that you can turn something into. But it can, it just takes a lot of work. On the right is sort of the dried flax, and we'll talk a little bit more about the next step that has to happen in a little bit here, but it does start to look a little bit like, people often describe it as looking like hair. Again, I'll hold this up again later, but people often say it looks like hair when it's sort of going along the way in its processing. Pam is asking if any textiles are produced in New Jersey today. Absolutely. Less commercially, more on the small scale. We'll touch a little bit more on that later. I don't think there's very many really big scale textile productions, but certainly on a small scale, textiles are very much still produced in New Jersey. All right, so cotton, wool, flax, those are definitely our primary materials in the 19th century. One other material that was available, but not commonly, would have been silk. Just like today, silk would have been rare, more expensive, and that comes from where you're getting it from. It's literally being processed from the larva of a special moth. And they're very hard to grow, to produce. So there were some attempts to grow silk here in the United States. But by and large, it was imported from places like China and then processed here. There was a particularly big craze of silk raising in about the 1830s, but that crashed by the end of the decade. It's a really finicky thing. If you don't raise them just right, the silk is not very good. So it quickly became apparent that it was easier and cheaper to import the larva from China and then process the silk from there, rather than growing them and harvesting them themselves here. But Patterson, again, did eventually take off with silk production. You may have heard of Patterson being referred to as the Silk City, and that's particularly toward the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Huge amounts of silk are being produced in Patterson. Some of the biggest mills there are silk producing mills. Again, using that water power that's running through there to really have some lots and lots of silk production, and other mills as well. But 1890s is sort of when it's really at the height of its strength there. Any questions on sort of those raw materials and their raw state before we'll talk a little bit more about their processing here, but I'll just pause if there's any questions at this juncture here. I love the linen and silk. Yeah, well, I will, just to kind of keep in I held up the wool, and yeah, so the cotton obviously is much softer, kind of a bumpier material, and then the silk. If we were in person, I would be passing all of these around, because it's interesting. Even though we know what these all feel like, sort of comparing the raw materials can be really interesting to really feel how different they all feel. There's no mistaking them when you feel the 4 different materials. They're so unique and different. Okay, so with wool, you have to start by shearing the sheep. The wonderful shears on the bottom right are the tool you would use to do this. And even today with electric razors, shearing a sheep is no easy task. And if you've ever seen someone do it by hand with the shears, it is really impressive. You can see in that painting a little bit of what it entails. And you have to hold the sheep in such a way that they don't move around. Obviously, you don't want to cut your sheep. So you have to hold them still, cut off the wool, and you ideally want to get it off in sort of as big a piece as possible. You don't want lots of little tiny tufts of wool, so that you have the best wool possible to work with, especially the sort of part around the back and everything. So really a very highly skilled thing to get the wool successfully off of your sheep. Sam, yes, I know, and it's one of the things that we all love to do. And if we were in person, I know it's one of the best things to be able to feel and touch those raw materials and pass them around. Well, imagine, right? Imagine. But wool is in some ways one of the easier materials to sort of do that processing of, despite that. But you would, after shearing it, you'd have to wash your wool, of course, have to clean it. And then your next step would be carding it. So you can see the two examples of carders. They look a lot like if you have a dog or a cat, sort of just the comb that you might use for a dog or a cat. And you literally just take the wool between it and pull it, pull it, pull it. You're getting all the knots out and trying to make nice long strands of wool. So that instead of being kind of clumpy like we saw before, we have nice long strands like this that can then be turned into your yarn successfully. So that's kind of what carding is doing for you. Yes, definitely different kinds of wool, Esther, both from different breeds of sheep, certainly different kinds of wool. And I, off the top of my head, I can't tell you the different breeds, but there certainly are many different breeds of sheep, but also different parts of the sheep. So like the wool sort of on the back of the sheep is going to give you a different feel, different sort of texture than the stuff maybe on the legs or things like that. So some of those sort of shorter fibers from the legs and things like the sort of smaller areas would probably have been used for like stuffing of things, or if you're making bunting almost, that kind of thing. And then the better wool from the back and underside would probably be what would be used more for actually turning into yarn. Good question, good question. So this fun tool here is called a Hetchel. So remember we said flax took a lot to process? Well, this is the tool that you have to use to turn that plant we saw into something that looks like this hair here that can then be spun into your fiber to then be turned into a textile. So you're literally beating that plant into the right texture, right consistency. So those are as sharp and pointy as you would think. This is the big tool. I've seen even bigger ones. This one's probably on the relatively small side. And if you see someone produce flax, they just literally are hitting it over and over and over against the flax. So quite a laborious process. So flax had the advantage that it could be grown here, but it was a challenging thing to prepare it even before it's been spun. I have a question from Martha here. Cashmere is from goats. Did people use them at this time in history? For the best of what I know, I don't have a 100% answer as far as what using them here in the United States. Certainly elsewhere people were using cashmere. I believe it was being imported into the United States at this point. I don't know that anyone was necessarily processing it here, but I don't have a 100% answer for that. But certainly some people were making cashmere from goats, but probably more elsewhere in the world. Longstreet Farms in Holmdel does a program where they shear the sheep and card the wool. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, for sure. I know, it's so impressive to watch, to see that. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'll have to, it's so fun to watch them do that. So of course, our next step after that processing is spinning. And that has to be done for any of these materials. Slightly different spinning wheels. Sometimes they're spinning techniques for the different materials, but essentially they're all being spun. And at its most basic level, there's nothing magic about spinning. You're literally just twisting your fiber between your fingers. You know, literally that's all it is to become something like the yarn. There's just tools that people have, you know, created to do it faster. The drop spindle, like you see on the left, has been around for, you know, hundreds, probably thousands of years. People figured out the drop spindle, just literally letting gravity do the work for you. It's hard to see here, but you're literally just spinning it and letting gravity turn your wool or whatever you're spinning into that finished yarn, thread, etc. The drop spindle has the advantage that it's very portable. It can be taken wherever you're going. If you imagine that women were primarily the ones doing the spinning, and they often had tasks that required a lot of their attention, whether it's cooking, whether it's a 2-year-old running off and needing to get, you know, run after The drop spindle could be very handy in that regard because it could be used in between other tasks while doing other things. So it definitely had some advantages, but it was slower than the spinning wheel. And the spinning wheel is certainly the classic tool that we think of. You know, it's made its way into fairy tales because of how ubiquitous it would have been, and many, many households would have had one. It's also much more skilled to use than the drop spindle. The drop spindle is fairly basic to use. The spinning wheel is a very active, involved process. You're really engaged doing it, walking back and forth. It's not something that just sort of spins itself. It's very much an active process, a skilled process, especially if you want really nice, good yarn or thread. Your spinning is very, very important. No one wants lumpy, chunky thread that's uneven throughout, right? It would be a disaster once you start trying to make your finished product. So some people might have had both, one or the other, depending on what worked. Both existed. There is slightly different styles, as I said, of spinning wheels for flax and things like that, but the basic principle is the same, that you're just using a tool to twist your fat fiber for you. All right, I'm gonna pause here and see if anyone, a few questions have come in as I've gone along. Anything else anyone wants to jump in on? We'll start looking now in a minute here at our finished products, but so I'll give a moment if anyone wants to jump in about our processing. Okay, I know you're all waiting to get to the finished products here. So we are going to start with woven textiles. So these are 3 woven textiles from the museum's collection. This picture isn't the greatest, and we'll be looking at them closer up, each of them in a moment. But I wanted to show you the 3 together because it gives you a sense of the range that you can get with a woven piece. And we'll talk about the difference, but just broadly speaking, if you start on the left side, the most simple, basic woven piece, sort of progressing to a much, much, much more complex on the right. So we'll talk about the techniques and everything that went into them, but kind of showing you the range that you can get with essentially the same process of weaving. So can't talk about weaving without looms. So the one on the left is just a very small table loom. The one on the right is perhaps more what we would expect from a loom, a really big size piece that would fill a room essentially. And both of them really operate on the same principle. If, you know, as a kid, you did a little pot holder or something, right? The sort of over, under, over, under, over, under, that very basic technique that even kids can do is essentially what these more complex weavings do. There's just a machine, a tool to help you do it easier and faster and with more complex patterns. So you're essentially laying out your pattern when you lay your threads and the way you set up your petals. So with your feet, when you push the pedal, it separates your threads in such a way that when you pass your shuttle through, you can see it there, and it does hold just the end of your string there. So that, you know, so it's going through, you pass it through, and back and forth using your feet to control the pattern, your hands to pass the thread back and forth. Also very skilled, a lot of the skill in sort of setting it up, but it can be everywhere from very, very simple and basic to much more complex. Again, getting those different range of woven pieces that we saw. So that first one on the left was, as I said, that very simple. Closer up, you can now see the weave. From a distance, you almost couldn't even see the weave, but you can see it now. All one color though, right? No pattern, no change in color, nothing. There's a small embroidered border, but that's it. We presume that this person, Mary A. Pennypacker, was the maker. We unfortunately don't know anything more about her. We can't confirm that she made it, but she did sort of sew a piece of fabric with her name into this piece. And it definitely looks like a piece that was used, probably a well-used coverlet of some sort, but very, very simple and basic. Oh, I see Ian. Oh, thank you, Ian. Thank you for sharing for the different types of wool there. Thank you. There's different types of wool, alpaca and wool from sheep, and the cashmere and pashmina from goats. Thank you, Ian, for clarifying there. Jute, the one here, I don't believe so. This particular one I don't believe is jute. I think this one is either wool or linen. It's very close up. I believe this one is wool, this particular piece. So next level up of textile. So now we do have a pattern, but still a fairly basic repeating geometric pattern, just sort of basic geometric shapes, things like that. So the change starts to happen in the 19th century with weaving, where it shifts from being done mostly by women, mostly in the home, to being done more and more in sort of professional weaving centers, and increasingly by men. So it's sort of a trade that's becoming professionalized. So even before it becomes fully done, you know, in a factory, it's becoming more and more professionalized and done outside of the home by people whose job is to weave, rather than a woman who is weaving on the side as well as something else. So Mary A. Pennypacker, she was probably just a woman who wove that piece for her family in addition to her 1,001 other things she was doing. This one, we don't know for sure, but it's possible it was done by a professional weaver or at least by a very skilled individual. It certainly shows a high level of skill. It is a double coverlet. You can sort of see the two sides there. And it's actually in a T shape, which was to accommodate a poster bed. If you imagine having the posters at the foot of your bed, you would want your coverlet to be able to fit around it and not get caught up in it. So the T shape was common to help fit around that. And this was a very popular style for bed coverings in the 19th century. So you can see these sort of geometric designs and things like that were very common. Again, could have been professionally done, could have still been done in the home. So before we move on to that third piece, we have to talk about the Jacquard loom. Which actually was invented in New Jersey. It was actually introduced in Paterson in the 1870s. And it really upped the game of what was possible with weaving. And we probably owe our early computers to the Jacquard loom. So if you look at that picture of one on the left-hand side, way more complex than that loom we saw in a few minutes ago. And they used punch cards, just like early computers, to essentially program in the pattern that you were going to make. So that image on the right, that piece, that one is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. But you can see, if you didn't know, you would probably assume it was some sort of drawing. It is so detailed. You could never get that by a purely hand-done loom, but that was done on a Jacquard loom. That's the level of detail that this new style of loom, allowed to be done. So it really changed the game in terms of what was being professionally woven. Yeah, they can be highly decorative now, have a whole new levels of complexity that you could never have by hand. And so this final one here could have been done on a Jacquard loom. We don't know for certain, unfortunately. Like many of our pieces, we don't have exact provenance or history, but it's likely that it was, just given the level of detail, the level of complexity. It would have been very, very, very difficult to do fully by hand on that, hand loom that we saw. So probably it was. So you can see, this is no longer just a repeating geometric shape or pattern. We now have this very ornate, intricate bird here. And those sort of flowers were very popular, sort of floral or animal imagery was very popular on coverlets as well. You can see this development, this major shift that's occurring through the 19th century. And the thing that goes along with some of this, so of course it frees up time for women if they're no longer having to maybe spin and weave and all of their things. So it frees up a huge amount of time for women. Imagine that, the shift from spending so much of your life, cleaning the wool, carding the wool, spinning the wool. Oh, now you still have to weave it or sew it or crochet it. Think about the time that took to even be able to buy ready-made fabric. Even if you still had to sew your own clothes, it's hard to underestimate sort of the shift, the amount of time that this gained for women. So it's a pretty, remarkable shift. Sort of not coincidental that the 19th century is when you start to see the development of so many women's groups, women's organizations, not necessarily working class women, they still had a lot of work to do, but for a lot of middle class women, they had much, much more time on their hands than they ever would have had prior to this point. Right, any Other questions? Well, I'll do one final weaving thing. Actually, that'll sort of tie into perhaps some of yours, which is a modern weaver. So this is one way that textile production is continuing in New Jersey. This woman, Ann Choi, does have a farm in the area. And she does actually go all the way from raising her own sheep. So that sheep we saw at the beginning, that's actually one of her sheep. She raises them, she shears them. You can see her spinning there at her foot-pedaled spinning wheel, and then she does weave it. And most of her pieces are more artistic, less sort of on the functional side, but she's really using all the same techniques and skills that people have been using for thousands of years in textile production. So that is certainly one way that it is continuing to this day. So certainly we have not lost the art of textiles here. Any questions on weaving before we move to what I know many of you are looking forward to, which is the quilts? All right. We're going to start by looking at this image of a quilting bee, because one thing that starts to pop up in the 19th century are these sort of the social nature of quilting. It's something which is not being done just in the home alone, like so much of women's work. It was something that could be done as a social activity. You'd go over to a friend's house and you can, maybe share tips and techniques or just gossip, whatever you wanted to do while working on your quilts individually, together. So definitely a very different type of thing than many other activities. And perhaps you were freed up to have the time to quilt more by not having to spin and all of that of your fabric to begin with. Esther says lots of work. Yes, so much work, so much work. Yeah, quilting is certainly no exception. Also lots and lots of work. But you can see these women here are enjoying themselves while they quilt. But these sort of quilting bees or these quilting frolics start to pop up, and you see them mentioned in songs and letters. It was certainly a big thing, an important social activity, sort of starting in the mid-19th century. The first quilt we're going to look at here is a nice pieced quilt. So certainly as we go through the quilts, the quilters should jump in and share their wisdom and all of that. But a couple of things that I find particularly neat about this particular quilt. To begin with, of course, it's hand sewn. We do not have a sewing machine. So every single one of those squares, and each one of those small squares is made up of 9 pieces. So each of those is sewn together onto that square to make the whole thing. Each one is stitched by hand. So a massive amount of work to do it and to really make this precise, tiny stitches. And I also just love the splash of color. There's almost no two fabrics the same. There's a little bit of sense maybe of patterns in some areas, but a lot of it is just kind of random. It's this beautiful expression, which is another thing that's really neat about quilts. It's where you start to see women expressing themselves. We often don't see much of left behind from women at this time. They weren't very likely to leave behind any written record, but they might leave behind a beautiful quilt that does express their personality, even if it doesn't speak words. So you can imagine that each of these scraps of fabric, maybe it had an important significance. Maybe it was from the rag, the scrap bag that she'd been collecting. You can almost imagine a story for every piece of fabric that you have there. So, just a beautiful, beautiful quilt in that regard. But I'll open up this one for comments from anyone, particularly from our quilters, if there's anything you want to jump in with. No comments yet. Okay, we'll keep, I love the fabric. Go ahead.
Do you have any idea of when this was made?
So we don't have an exact date, probably sort of first half of the 19th century. We unfortunately, just the nature of the pieces we have, we don't for the most part have exact dating, exact provenance, but based on, sort of the best that our curator could tell from other similar quilts and things, it's probably sort of first half of the 19th century. It's not, yeah, oh, yeah, a lot of fabric. Oh, do you know the size? The full size is about bed cover, sort of double bed size. So if you imagine that. So each of those small squares is only about this big. They're really quite small. So probably, I don't know, 3 inches by 3 inches of each of those squares, you know, the full thing being about the size, you know, of a double bed. So it's a pretty good sized quilt with, yeah, very tiny squares. Susan says, I love how the tiniest pieces were used. I know, you're not wasting anything, right? I often use these quilts. We do a sort of recycled art program with the Scouts, and I often use the quilts as a really neat example of how people reuse stuff, right? They weren't just throwing out their clothes, they were repurposing and reusing things in new ways. So it's always fun to see that. Most of the fabrics in the quilt were likely from scraps from dressmaking and other clothing women were making. Absolutely, yeah, for sure, for sure. So yeah, it could have been scraps from dressmaking or from clothes that were no longer able to be worn or from all sorts of things, for sure.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this, I can't tell if this is actually quilted. Is this just patchwork or is it quilted?
It is on the back. Yep, it is actually quilted. Yeah. It's hard to tell in this picture, I know, but it is actually quilted. Yeah. Very good question. Thank you, Martha. So we'll take a look at our next quilt here. So I'll look close up at one of these trees in a moment because they are quite impressive, but it's sort of nice to see the whole breadth of it. So these tree designs were very popular in the 19th century. So when, again, we don't know exact dating, but probably mid-19th century on this one is sort of the best estimate. It is still hand sewn. And as we'll see with the close-up, and you can kind of tell here, each of those leaves, those branches, those are little tiny pieces of fabric put together. So, you know, obviously each tree put together, to each square, to the big part, all of that. And no two are different. There are 30 of these trees, and each square is, you know, these are probably about a foot square, each of the tree squares, and there's about 30 of them in the full thing to give you an idea of the size of this one. But no two are the same. And some have a lot of, you know, the same colors, some have a whole splash of colors, really a wide variety. But it really looks like the maker took time and care with exactly what colors they were using. None of it looks completely random. It looks like they really thought about, someone mentioned the tiniest pieces, right? Which tiny scrap was going to go in each tree and laid it out, you know, the way they wanted. But to look close up here at two of the squares, it's a nice contrast. One has all the same color fabric, and one has almost none the same, a little bit of a pattern, a few repeating, but very, very different patterns. But the same style is used, you know, the same sort of repeating in terms of how they're laid out, but very different colors. This one does have initials. We unfortunately don't know who JAS is, but they did embroider their initials into that quilt square there to make that. But I'll throw this open to anyone who wants any comments on this quilt here. All right. So turning to a different style of quilt here, it's Tufted Quilt. So this one you can see the back as well as the front. This one is a lot smaller, probably made for a child, perhaps even done by someone who is still learning. It's not quite as small as this picture makes it look, but it's probably, you know, maybe 4 feet long, something, 4 foot square, something like that. Much smaller than the others, but still beautifully done. And these are all different cotton fabrics. This one, you know, probably coming from those cotton mills, as we mentioned, sort of coming out of Patterson in New Jersey. And just to, yeah, so there was, by 1870, you had, you know, much more ready availability of cotton cloth for Americans, but even before that, you started to have these cotton mills popping up. But still no sort of similar fabrics, no identical fabrics, a lot of mix of colors, and the little tufts in the center of each square that gives it its name. So much less complex pattern, but still kind of a beautiful quilt here. Maybe a crib quilt, thank you. Yeah, Pam, absolutely, it very well might be, for sure. it would be about the right size for a crib. Very good thought. It would probably be a nice comforting pattern, you know, nice soft thing to have. It definitely looks like it's been well cared for, but well used also. These are certainly all functional pieces, you know, intended to be used and all of that. They're not decorative. Anything else on this one here? So we also have a couple of these pieces which are unfinished. As you can of course tell here, not put part of a fuller quilt, someone who started it. And it looks quite modern when you see this, both the fabric and the design, but this was very common. This sort of star tooth shape was very popular, particularly toward the late 19th century. You start to get more emphasis on those geometric designs over the more floral patterns that were common sort of early to mid-century. And still some skill and everything shown in creating the sawtooth, even if they never went on to finish it. We don't know if they, you know, just lost interest or something else happened, but we do just have a couple pieces from this unfinished quilt. But it's neat to see kind of a step in the process of how it was put together there. Any other thoughts or questions on the, oh, do they use templates? Debbie, good question. I think it would really depend on the person. I think certainly people were informally sharing patterns and things like that with each other. So it would probably depend person to person. You are starting to get more books being published about things like that, but I would say overall it was more common, more likely that you were doing either your own or maybe something that a friend or family member showed you than sort of a formalized template per se. But certainly it's starting to be more common to have sort of patterns and things like that available. So none of these are machine sewn. These are all hand sewn. We don't know the exact date on any of these. This one is probably toward the later 19th century, given the patterning, sort of second half of the 19th century, but we don't know the exact date, but it is still hand sewn. You know, and hand sewing definitely persisted after, you know, after sewing machines came about. But any other questions or thoughts on these quilts here? All right, so we're going to turn to our last sort of big focus, a type of finished piece of lace. So much less common today for people to do lace making. It's definitely a much more involved craft that doesn't get you as much of a finished product. It takes a lot of time and patience to get even a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny piece of lace. And it would have been something that was more likely to be done by someone perhaps middle class or up above that who had the time, the leisure time to devote to it. But of course it does eventually start to be done by machines, but we are talking hand lace making at this point. And so this lace pillow would help you make your piece of lace. You'd have your pattern on that brown piece of paper. The holes are where the pins go. And then look at all the bobbins. There's, I don't know, maybe 10 bobbins there tucked in. All those pieces of thread have to be put in a particular way, you know, sort of woven almost through that pattern that you're laying out with your pins. So very precise, just sort of the idea of templates was not as common for quilts. For lace making, absolutely, you're using a template. Even whether you created your own or something that someone gave you or, you know, that you purchased, you were absolutely using a pattern for lace making. Yeah, isn't it neat? Isn't it neat to see the process of lace making? Yeah, thank you, Susan. So it's sort of, yeah, and the lace pillow would allow it to go around. You could sort of make a longer one, almost like a giant pin cushion. And the size of this, it's about, you know, it's probably maybe a foot and a half wide, you know, it's sort of each direction. So it's a pretty good sized pillow. So you could make a pretty good sized piece of lace on this. And this particular pattern is narrow, but you could of course do one that was wider as well, right? So it gives you some flexibility there. So those lace bobbins in that previous picture were fairly plain. These are much fancier. So notice that they have, in addition to those beadings and other decorations, one of them has Ruth on it. One has 1871, I think that is, and then Eliza on the bottom one. So this is something that no one's ever gonna really see, right? I mean, your lace bobbin is not the finished product, but someone went to the trouble to have this highly ornate lace bobbin. So it's really kind of interesting to think about, again, this sort of expression of women's artistry. Whether or not they actually, you know, made those decorations, I'm sure they had an impact in that and influencing it. So it's a neat way to, again, see that expression from women. But same function as those ones we saw before, just holding your thread. You wouldn't really get as much thread on these. There's a lot more decoration versus, you know, thread holding capability, but I suppose it's worth it if you want that decorative nature. Am I aware of any classes on spinning, weaving, or lace making? There's definitely are some local textile artists. I don't have them off the top of my head, but if you're interested, I can send Nadia some contacts for some local textile people, and she could perhaps pass it on to the group. When we had this exhibit, we certainly had some lace makers come. Ann Choi, who I mentioned, I don't know if she specifically teaches classes, but she's certainly very involved with all sorts of textile artists and could probably put you in touch with the right person. I'm sure, you know, they do exist. So why don't I send Nadia some contacts of some local textile people, and she can pass it along. Because yeah, they definitely do exist. Definitely do exist around. Okay, so these squares show some of the different types of lace that exist out there. Some of it that sort of more netted style, the filet lace on the top right, the bobbin lace on the bottom left is sort of named for being made with those bobbins like we saw before. And these squares, these could have just been practice squares or something like that, or something that would be then added onto something else. Because just like today, you weren't making a whole outfit of lace, right? It would be an accent piece, or usually most people don't make a whole dress out of lace. We might today, but not very common. Usually it's an accent, right? And that would certainly have been the case in the 19th century. You'd have as a decorative element, an accent, maybe a tablecloth, something like that, a napkin edge, but not, you know, not a full piece. And these would have been most likely linen, would be most likely the material used for these lace pieces. So showing another use for it, this is a lace collar. So it could go around your neck to kind of dress up an outfit, you know, at a time when people didn't necessarily have a lot of clothes. You know, your lace collar could really add a really nice element to perhaps an otherwise plain dress, or just give it a different look, kind of dress it up, change up your outfit a bit. This is a really beautiful piece. There's a lot of beautiful things about it, but the one that really strikes me from a technical perspective, and I'm not a lace maker, but you know, seeing how lace is made, you notice there's no seam on this. This was made as one full piece, so it had to be made with perfect symmetry, so that you knew exactly sort of when and where to curve and turn to make sure it lined up. So definitely a lot of skill displayed in the making of this, to make it so perfectly and beautifully made, you know, not pieces that are added together. Another lace piece here. So something else we might add lace onto is the edge of a christening gown. And this particular christening gown is fairly unusual in our collection because we do know who owned it and who wore it. So it was actually first worn around 1846 by Louis M. Noe of Madison. And then it was also worn by his granddaughter, who you can see in that portrait there, around 1901, Ruth Pearson Churchill. And chances are it may have even been worn by other family members, but we know of its first owner and wearer, and we know it got passed down through the family. So it's a pretty neat piece in that regard to not only know who wore it, have a picture of it being worn, and have that history to it. But that would have been a common way that lace was used. You know, an accent on a special occasion, something like a christening gown, a wedding dress, to give it a little bit more, you know, fanciness, so to speak, as you're going along. So any questions on lace? We have just a few quick final thoughts after the lace, but any lace questions before we do sort of our final couple things here? Okay. So just touching very briefly on the care of textiles. Of course, you can't talk about textiles without care of textiles. We won't go into it too much, but I do want to highlight ironing, which would of course been extremely necessary, especially with things like linens that would all need to be ironed to not be totally wrinkled. So very much a functional thing. Also sort of softening your fibers the way our dryers do today. But these two particular ones are very small. They're again about only 3 or 4 inches long. So they're toy irons, probably used by a little girl, maybe imitating her mom, you know, kind of practicing that skill. Like we have a little toy kitchen today, same idea. Notice the swan decoration on one of them, sort of very ornately done. You might also have mini irons like this for ironing a smaller section of a piece, like a collar, something like that. You might also need different size irons the same way. We'll finish by talking about the sewing machine. We didn't talk too much about sewing, but certainly that idea of it ran through a lot of it. Of course, quilting involves lots of sewing, and all those ones we saw were hand sewn. But the sewing machine is another thing that really revolutionizes work, particularly for women. Certainly there was more ready availability of ready-made cloth and even clothes, but if you were still making your own clothes, having a sewing machine was, you know, hugely impactful. This particular one is particularly interesting. It's from about 1870, 1880, that range. So later than the first one, so it's 1851 when Singer's sewing machine first comes out. But notice that this one is hand cranked. I can kind of understand why that style didn't take off. If you imagine trying to kind of guide your fabric while turning with your hand, it's very much like, you know, patting your head, rubbing your stomach or whatever that is, right? Not an easy thing to do. So you can see why this style did not take off and the foot pedal became the preferred one. Also, your arm would get so tired. But it is worth thinking about the sewing machine and its impact as well as we sort of wrap up our discussion of textiles in the 19th century here. So I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment so I can see everybody better and maybe hold up some things, but I do just want to share this screen because it does have my contact info. Please feel free to reach out to me with any additional questions or comments. Nadia also does have my contact info, and like I said, I'll send her some contact info of local textile artists to try to disseminate to the group. Certainly it's alive and well. And I was trying to find somewhere I'm only going to stop sharing. I had a statistic of the number of with this, and I was trying to find my statistic in my notes here, and I've lost it. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in while I try to find this one fact I was going to share.
Do you have any other quilts in your collection?
We have a few. We don't have a huge number. The couple who founded our collection were more interested in sort of the tool side of things. So certainly the bulk of our collection, you know, we have many woodworking tools and blacksmithing tools and things like that. So fortunately they did collect some textiles, and we've had a few donated over time, but it's certainly not as many. So there's a few others than the ones that, you know, you saw here, but we don't have a massive collection. Those are probably the nicest ones, some of the nicest ones. Oh, you're welcome, Susan. Thanks for coming.
Question. I have a question.
Oh, yep, go ahead.
Hi. In Pennsylvania, they have a tradition where they always make a mistake in their quilts, and it's called a humility square. And I was wondering if you had any information about that tradition in New Jersey.
It's really interesting. I have heard of that, and I don't unfortunately know for sure. My guess is that it probably was similar. I mean, New Jersey and Pennsylvania certainly had a lot of the same sort of cultural impulses and things like that. I don't unfortunately have any additional information, but I've certainly heard of that in a general sense, and I would not be surprised if it's also true here. It's a nice concept, isn't it?
Yes, because I always make mistakes.
You did it on purpose, though. It was not a mistake.
No.
It was an intentional thing, right?
The point is it's not intentional, because ultimately it's only God can do something perfect, so that even when you try, you're still going to fail. It's kind of part of that Amish thing.
Yeah, sure. Do I have any information on the Underground Railroad message quilt? I do not. I sort of found mixed things that they, about how true some of those were. I know there's a lot of sort of debate over that, but I don't have any specific information. We certainly don't have any that have that. But I have heard that was certainly a likely way to pass information, but I don't have any additional information. I'm sorry. Was someone else asking something? I don't know. I heard someone else. See if anyone else is typing there. So for the two of you, I think it was Mary and someone else who had the beautiful quilt, and Martha, the quilt in the background. Do you want to tell us anything about the quilts you have showcased behind you?
Nothing special.
I do scrap quilts, which is similar to what you were describing about recycling and using up pieces. So over the years, you collect fabric and then you just make scrap quilts. I try to use traditional designs and then modify them just for my own self-expression.
Very nice, very nice. Well, they're both beautiful. They're both beautiful. Thanks for having them as your backdrop. Great. Any other questions or thoughts or anything anyone wants to share? Thank you for sharing. You all have some good insights, so I really appreciate you sharing that as well. I seem to have a bit of an echo. I'm sorry about that. I don't know why I'm echoing.
Yeah, there's some back. What's it
I don't know.
backlog, but it wasn't happening throughout the rest of the presentation.
Well, that's good.
Towards the end, it's a sign saying, you did great.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you, Kathy. You're very welcome.
Yes. I know I want to thank you for presenting, and I feel like I learned a lot about quilting and just like textiles in general. I didn't know you were actually going to show the individual types of textiles, which is awesome. So that was enlightening for me, at least. So I found this was very engaging and really awesome.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And if anyone else is interested in more presentations from the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts, we're going to be having a couple more coming up in the coming months. So in November, we're going to have sweet treats, desserts, and delicacies from the Garden State. That sounds good. Right around Thanksgiving month, since we're all going to be in the food mindset. And then in December, we're going to have the history of Christmas carols. So get us some context for some of our favorite songs. So as the months get closer to those dates, signups will be available for all of those. And then also, just in general, we have a bunch more stuff coming up for September and October. Everything's free. Everything's on Zoom, unfortunately. But, it's a fun way to learn something for an hour from your very own home. So, pretty okay. But you just check our calendars and, feel free to sign up for anything that sounds interesting. We're also doing a lot of grab and go crafts for adults. So we just had our water candle on Tuesday, and then DIY succulent magnets at the end of the month. I don't know I think it might be full now, but it doesn't matter because in October we have more stuff coming up. So just keep checking our website, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're trying to connect with everyone regardless of all of this. So feel free to come. And also we're open to the public now. So if you guys want to get any books, we only ask that you limit your visit to an hour, but you're welcome to come in, print, use the computers, fax machine, copy machine. We're open. Limited hours, well, not limited, just slightly different hours for the branches in the main location, but we're here for you. regardless. But yes, I think that's a great place to end tonight's presentation. Again, thank you, Hilary, for coming out or staying in and presenting for us. And thanks to everyone for staying with us and listening and learning tonight. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Nadia, for having me. It was lovely to see you all. Hopefully see you all again next month. No, 2 months, 2 months. Who knows? Yeah. When is November?
It's going to fly by, so it's going to feel like next month. I have a feeling October is going to just swing on by. So we'll see you sooner than we think. But everybody have a good night. Stay safe. Get out of the rain if you're outside. And have a good day, okay?
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Let's make sure everyone's going.